The Battle of the Somme, also known as the Somme Offensive, was a battle of the First World War fought by the armies of the British and French empires against the German Empire. It took place between the 1st of July and the 18th of November 1916 on both sides of the River Somme in France. It was one of the largest battles of World War I, in which more than 1 million men were wounded or killed, making it one of the bloodiest battles in human history. A Franco-British commitment to an offensive on the Somme had been made during Allied discussions at Chantilly, Oise, in December 1915. The Allies agreed upon a strategy of combined offensives against the Central Powers in 1916, by the French, Russian, British, and Italian armies, with the Somme Offensive as the Franco-British contribution. The main part of the offensive was to be made by the French army, supported on the northern flank by the Fourth Army of the British Expeditionary Force. When the German army began the Battle of Verdun on the Meuse on 21 February 1916, many French divisions intended for the Somme were diverted and the supporting attack by the British became the principal effort. The first day on the Somme was a serious defeat for the German Second Army, which was forced out of its first line of defense by the French Sixth Army. From Foucault-Court-en-Santerre south of the Somme to Maricourt on the north bank, and by the British Fourth Army from Maricourt to the vicinity of the Albert-Bapaume Road. The first day on the Somme was also the worst day in the history of the British Army, which had c. 57,470 casualties, mainly on the front between the Albert-Bapaume Road and Gommecourt, where the attack was defeated and few British troops reached the German front line. The British Army on the Somme was a mixture of the remains of the pre-war regular army, the Territorial Force and the Kitchener Army, which was composed of PALS battalions, recruited from the same places and occupations. The battle is notable for the importance of air power and the first use of the tank. At the end of the battle, British and French forces had penetrated 6 miles into German-occupied territory, taking more ground than any offensive since the Battle of the Marne in 1914. The Anglo-French armies failed to capture Péronne and were still 3 miles from Bapaume, where the German armies maintained their positions over the winter. British attacks in the Ancre Valley resumed in January 1917 and forced the Germans into local withdrawals to reserve lines in February, before the scheduled retirement to the Siegfriedstellung began in March. The battle remains controversial over its necessity, significance and effect. Background: strategic developments. Allied war strategy for 1916 was decided at the Chantilly Conference from 6 to 8 December 1915. Simultaneous offensives on the Eastern Front by the Russian Army, on the Italian Front by the Italian Army, and on the Western Front by the Franco-British armies, were to be carried out at night time for the Central Powers to move troops between fronts during lulls. In December 1915, General Sir Douglas Haig replaced General Sir John French as Commander-in-Chief of the BEF. Haig favoured a British offensive in Flanders close to BEF's supply routes, to drive the Germans from the Belgian coast and end the U-boat threat from Belgian waters. Haig was not formally subordinate to Joffre, but the British played a lesser role on the Western Front and complied with French strategy. In January 1916, Joffre had agreed to the BEF making its main effort in Flanders, but in February 1916 it was decided to mount a combined offensive where the French and British armies met astride the Somme River in Picardy before the British offensive in Flanders. A week later the Germans began an offensive against the French at Verdun. The costly defense of Verdun forced the French army to commit divisions intended for the Somme offensive, eventually reducing the French contribution to 13 divisions in the Sixth Army, against 20 British divisions. By the 31st of May, the ambitious Franco-British plan for a decisive victory had been reduced to a limited offensive to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun with a battle of attrition on the Somme. The chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, intended to end the war by splitting the Anglo-French Entente in 1916. before its material superiority became unbeatable. Falkenhayn planned to defeat the large amount of reserves which the Entente could move into the path of a breakthrough, by threatening a sensitive point close to the existing front line and provoking the French into counter-attacking German positions. Falkenhayn chose to attack towards Verdun to take the Meuse heights and make the city untenable. The French would have to conduct a counter-offensive on ground dominated by the German army and ringed with masses of heavy artillery, leading to huge losses and bring the French army close to collapse. The British would then have to begin a hasty relief offensive and would also suffer huge losses. Falkenhayn expected the relief offensive to fall south of Arras against the Sixth Army and be destroyed. If such Franco-British defeats were not enough, Germany would attack the remnants of both armies and end the Western Alliance for good. The unexpected length of the Verdun offensive and the need to replace many exhausted units at Verdun depleted the German strategic reserve placed behind the Sixth Army, which held the Western Front from Hanneskamps, 18 kilometers southwest of Arras, to Saint-Éloi, south of Ypres, and reduced the German counter-offensive strategy north of the Somme to one of passive and unyielding defense. Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun began a week after Joffre and Haig agreed to mount an offensive on the Somme. The German offensive at Verdun was intended to threaten the capture of the city and induce the French to fight an attritional battle, in which German advantages of terrain and firepower would cause the French disproportionate casualties. The battle changed the nature of the offensive on the Somme, as French divisions were diverted to Verdun, and the main effort by the French diminished to a supporting attack for the British. German overestimation of the cost of Verdun to the French contributed to the concentration of German infantry and guns on the north bank of the Somme. By May, Joffre and Haig had changed their expectations of an offensive on the Somme, from a decisive battle to a hope that it would relieve Verdun and keep German divisions in France, which would assist the Russian armies conducting the Brusilov offensive. The German offensive at Verdun was suspended in July, and troops, guns, and ammunition were transferred to Picardy, leading to a similar transfer of the French 10th Army to the Somme front. Later in the year, the Franco-British were able to attack on the Somme and at Verdun sequentially, and the French recovered much of the ground lost on the east bank of the Meuse in October and December. Brusilov offensive. The Brusilov offensive absorbed the extra forces that had been requested on the 2nd of June by General von Bülow, the 2nd Army commander, for a spoiling attack on the Somme. On the 4th of June, Russian armies attacked on a 200-mile front, from the Romanian frontier to Pinsk, and eventually advanced 150 kilometers, reaching the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, against German and Austro-Hungarian troops of Armeegruppe von Linsingen and Armeegruppe Archduke Joseph. During the offensive, the Russians inflicted c. 1,500,000 losses, including c. 407,000 prisoners. 3 divisions were ordered from France to the Eastern Front on the 9th of June, and the spoiling attack on the Somme was abandoned. Only 4 more divisions were sent to the Somme front before the Anglo-French offensive began, bringing the total to 10.5 divisions. Falkenhayn, and then Hindenburg and Ludendorff, were forced to send divisions to Russia throughout the summer to prevent a collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army, and then to conduct a counter-offensive against Romania, which declared war against the Central Powers on the 27th of August. In July there were 112 German divisions on the Western Front and 52 divisions in Russia, and in November there were 121 divisions in the West and 76 divisions in the East. Tactical developments. The original British Expeditionary Force of 6 divisions and the Cavalry Division had lost most of the Army's pre-war regular soldiers in the battles of 1914 and 1915. The bulk of the Army was made up of volunteers of the Territorial Force and Kitchener's New Army, which had begun forming in August 1914. Rapid expansion created many vacancies for senior commands and specialist functions, which led to many appointments of retired officers and inexperienced newcomers. In 1914, Haig had been a lieutenant general in command of 1st Corps and was promoted to command the 1st Army in early 1915 and then the BEF in December, which eventually comprised 5 armies with 60 divisions. The swift increase in the size of the army reduced the average level of experience within it and created an acute equipment shortage. Many officers resorted to directive command to avoid delegating to novice subordinates. Although divisional commanders were given great latitude in training and planning for the attack of the 1st of July, since the heterogeneous nature of the 1916 army made it impossible for corps and army commanders to know the capacity of each division. Despite considerable debate among German staff officers, Falkenhayn continued the policy of unyielding defense in 1916. On the Somme front, Falkenhayn's construction plan of January 1915 had been completed. Barbed wire obstacles had been enlarged from one belt 5 to 10 yards wide to 2, 30 yards wide and about 15 yards apart. Double and triple thickness wire was used and laid 3 to 5 feet high. The front line had been increased from 1 trench line to 3, 150 to 200 yards apart. The first trench occupied by sentry groups, the second for the bulk of the front trench garrison and the third trench for local reserves. The trenches were traversed and had sentry posts in concrete recesses built into the parapet. Dugouts had been deepened from 6 to 9 feet to 20 to 30 feet, 50 yards apart and large enough for 25 men. An intermediate line of strongpoints about 1,000 yards behind the front line was also built. Communication trenches ran back to the reserve line, renamed the second line, which was as well built and wired as the first line. The second line was beyond the range of Allied field artillery. To force an attacker to stop and move field artillery forward before assaulting the line. Prelude. Anglo-French plan of attack. British intentions evolved as the military situation changed after the Chantilly Conference. French losses at Verdun reduced the contribution available for the offensive on the Somme and increased the urgency for the commencement of operations on the Somme. The principal role in the offensive devolved to the British, and on the 16th of June, Haig defined the objectives of the offensive as the relief of pressure on the French at Verdun and the infliction of losses on the Germans. After a 5-day artillery bombardment, the British Fourth Army was to capture 27,000 yards of the German first line. From Montauban to Serre, and the Third Army was to mount a diversion at Gommecourt. In a second phase, the Fourth Army was to take the German second position from Pozières to the Ancre and then the second position south of the Albert-Bapaume road, ready for an attack on the German third position south of the road towards Flers, when the reserve army, which included 3 cavalry divisions, would exploit the success to advance east and then north towards Arras. The French Sixth Army, with 1 corps on the north bank from Maricourt to the Somme and 2 corps on the south bank southwards to Foucaulcourt, would make a subsidiary attack to guard the right flank of the main attack being made by the British. German defences on the Somme after the of 1915. A third defence line, another 3,000 yards back from the Stützpunktlinie, was begun in February 1916 and was almost complete on the Somme front when the battle began. German artillery was organized in a series of Spefeuerstreifen. Each officer was expected to know the batteries covering his section of the front line and the batteries ready to engage fleeting targets. A telephone system was built, with lines buried 6 feet deep for 5 miles behind the front line, to connect the front line to the artillery. The Somme defences had 2 inherent weaknesses that the rebuilding had not remedied. The front trenches were on a forward slope, lined by white chalk from the subsoil and easily seen by ground observers. The defences were crowded towards the front trench, with a regiment having 2 battalions near the front trench system and the reserve battalion divided between the Stützpunktlinie and the second line. all within 2,000 yards and most troops within 1,000 yards of the front line, accommodated in the new deep dugouts. The concentration of troops at the front line on a forward slope guaranteed that it would face the bulk of an artillery bombardment, directed by ground observers on clearly marked lines.